As someone who teaches a major program at a business school, I have to be somewhat careful in what I'm going to say next. I guess I'm a big believer that in that sort of 70-20-10 theory of development, the reality is a lot of what develops people is being on the job, doing things, right? And sometimes the most impactful thing you do to develop people is put them in different roles that help them develop different capabilities, right? And that's the 70% of leadership development. The 20% is more coaching and mentoring, and it's a more one-to-one kind of coaching, advising, mentoring, whatever the mix is you want to be pointing to. And, I think there is value in all three of having good advisors, having good mentors, and having good coaches. And that little triangle, those people play different, but I think quite complementary roles.
Hello, and welcome to the Show Your Value podcast, where we explore the art of value creation in three macro buckets: material value creation, emotional energy value creation, and spiritual value creation. Today, my very special guest is Michael Watkins. Michael is a globally recognized leadership transitions expert and author of the best-selling book, The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed Faster and Smarter. In 2023, Watkins was inducted into the Thinkers 50 Management Hall of Fame and has developed tools to help professionals navigate personal and organizational change challenges. He has spent the past 2 decades working with leaders as they transition to new roles, build their teams, and transform their organizations. The First 90 Days has sold more than 1.5 million copies and has been translated into 23 different languages. Over the past 20 years, Watkins has authored 15 books on leadership and negotiation, which have won several awards. In your latest book, The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, I read getting ready for this discussion here today. Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Delighted to be with you, Lee.
All right. And what I'm getting from your work, and I barely scratched the surface on all the stuff that you've done, is that we both have a passion for developing capable leaders. And, you've said that, you're just super passionate about every stage of the leadership journey, from, becoming a leader, transitioning into a new role, onboarding, all the stages that they go throughout their career. And then this concept of value creation. I love that you talk about that so regularly. So if you could, for our listeners, give us a little bit of your background, how you developed a passion for this and why.
Yeah. So, and you're completely right. So I do absolutely have a passion for this. And, I sort of identify myself as an educator, Lee. I mean, that's the core of the self-identity. I don't see myself as a guru or a thought leader. I'm sure to some degree, I play those roles, but the really central, core of my being is focused on educating and therefore developing people. These days, it's mostly executives. When I was younger, obviously, it was MBAs, kind of, or master's degree students. But I've come to really just love working with sort of those high potential, mid-tier, about to on the cusp of heading to the senior levels kind of people, right? Because they're just at such an interesting stage in their lives, right? They've come up a long way. They've often sacrificed a lot to get where they are. And, they're at that stage where they're kind of looking up thinking, yeah, I can do that. But they're also thinking, gee, do I want to do that? Right. And what does it mean if I do that? And so, in the programs I teach these days, I get people more or less at that point in their lives. And so you can work with them, both as leaders, but also as people. Right. And it very much connects, by the way, to something I hope we'll talk about, which is energy, right? And how you stay energized as a leader, right? What continues to push you forward in moments like. Quick background. So engineer originally by training, electrical engineer. I call myself a recovering engineer, right? Because you come out of engineering with very strong, kind of systems, logic, rationality. But I pretty quickly moved more in the direction of, the softer in quote side of things and then into more and more into leadership. The way station between that, though, was negotiation. I taught negotiation and diplomacy for many years at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and then at the Harvard Business School. And that, and I know we'll talk about this because you mentioned it in the intro, really gave me some insight into what value creation means in a more systematic way in some senses. And I think I've imported some of that work, into the the core of the leadership stuff that I do these days. Today I'm at IMD, which I love, great business school, was on Switzerland. I teach one of IMD's big senior leadership programs called Transition to Business Leadership, kind of people we were just talking about. Yeah, and that's me.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the number of students that IMD puts through. It's incredible. And I was looking at the website and all the work that they're doing. It's really good stuff. And I don't know if you know this, but my business partner before he passed in my current business, Execute to Win, was Jack Welch. We met in 2008. In 2011, he became a business partner of mine. He told me I had the best business management system he'd ever seen. And it's like we're on the same road. It was just, he just did it at a whole different scale than I did. And I just enjoyed all my time with him.
Well, I've got a story related to Jack Welch, which is his second partner, Susie Wetlaufer, was the editor who edited the very first Harvard Business Review article I ever wrote. And she gave me the formula, the value creation formula for how to write Harvard Business Review articles. And I still tell people the value creation formula for writing a good Harvard Business Review article that she taught me. And then of course she and Jack Welch went on to do some very interesting stuff together, right? Including some good books. So yeah.
Yeah. And I stay in touch with Susie. She's great. I think the world's a better place because of the work that she's doing for sure. The other thing I get out of your work or from your work is that you help leaders think about thinking better. Cause I just think in this world, they're so reactionary, and how do you step back and really make better decisions that create more value? And, kind of getting like the first 90 days, I know it's just talking about a transition. It's a great title for the book to make the point. But what are the onboarding systems and things that leaders should be thinking about to make sure the transition goes well?
So I got just as background, I got interested pretty early in transitions, and I think I kind of caught a wave, Lee, which timing sometimes is everything, right? I call myself the accidental guru, right? I didn't really plan to go out and have this happen exactly, but I wrote that book, the first edition of that book back in 2003, second edition in 2012, and I'm working on the third one right now. But at that point in time, there was almost nothing really good out there about how to take charge in a new leadership role, right? There was lots about leadership. Some very great work had been done. There was quite a bit about change and leading change. But the intersection of those things, right? You take a new job, you barely know where the toilets are. You certainly don't know where the bodies are buried. You're struggling your way up the learning curve. And at the same time, you're expected to start to have an impact on this organization, right? And so it was the combination of those things that really fascinated me. And then I think probably, from engineering, I then did my PhD in decision theory, game theory, negotiation theory. And so that continued kind of my systematic training, I guess is the way I would put it, in rigor and decision making. So when I wrote the first 90 days, my goal was to, create actionable frameworks that leaders could take and use, right? And not just some, theory about what makes a good transition, but really make it practical. And at that point, I was doing a lot of work with Johnson & Johnson, teaching programs about how to take charge in a new leadership role. And so that was kind of the crucible for me to develop a lot of these ideas and test them and make them practical. And then after that I wrote the first 90 days.
Okay. And I believe one of the biggest challenges is clarity around the value that the leader's supposed to create. So the organizations typically do a really poor job of it. And I work with startups and everything in between, all the way to $60 billion plus market cap organizations. And it's the same challenge everywhere. I mean, there's different things going on because, size creates different human nature things to happen or behaviors to happen. But being really clear about this is the value or the outcomes that this role is required to achieve. This is why we're investing in you. And it's a two-way street, right? The organization should be doing it, but the leader should be asking for it. And if it's not well defined, they should be helping to define it. Talk about that a little bit. I think that's one of the biggest reasons it doesn't work.
Yeah, maybe wind back one step briefly, right? Which is, successful onboarding is a mixture of getting oriented to the situation and the organization and getting integrated into the organization. And those are two quite distinct things, right? Getting oriented is about kind of a lot of the detail of how the organization works and, the technical parts of the organization, product, markets, technology, strategy, structure, organization system, policies, practices. And organizations in general do a pretty good job these days of orienting people coming in from the outside. But they still do a really poor job on average in actually integrating people, accelerating and integrating people, right? Knitting them into the fabric of the organization, having them understand, to your point, how will they create value, right? What are they uniquely able to do to create value in the context of the organization? And I had the new role, and I was smiling because I was teaching the first 90 days program I do at IMD last week. And something I do at the very beginning is lay out what I think are the 7 big questions that you should always use in transition to kind of orient yourself to what's going on and keep coming back to. I recommend people print them out and put them on the monitor of the computer, and stare at them periodically and think about whether they really feel like they know the answer. And question number 1, the North Star question is, how will I create value, right? And that means inquiry into, the organization. It means gaining alignment with your manager. It means understanding what other key stakeholders are looking for from you. It means nailing down expectations, but also how your success will be measured, what the timeframes are. And I push people when I coach them. And I probably one of the more fun things I get to do is coach leaders taking new roles at fairly senior levels. And I always push them on what are you uniquely able to do to create value, right? What is it that you can do for this organization that nobody else can do? Because that's what you should be focusing on doing, right? And question number 2 in that series, and we still won't go through all 7, but is how will I amplify myself, right? How will I magnify my ability to create value? What resources can I draw upon? That's my team, right? But it's also potentially, the support system I put in place. I was talking to a new CHRO yesterday, and we were talking about, does she need a chief of staff, right? She's scaled up dramatically into a much larger organization. There's a lot of complexity. She's onboarding. She wants to be able to focus on, a few core things, but she's got to drive a whole lot of other stuff, right? And partly she drives that through her team, but in the spirit of amplifying yourself energetically, you might need some other people around you, that are going to help do that for you. Yeah. So, but I think, back to your point is I don't think organizations necessarily do a great job of really helping people understand what are they there fundamentally to do. And so you kind of got to go as a leader and wrestle that out of the organization, right? Extract it. Until, and keep asking yourself that question, Lee, because the answer may change, right? And the answer almost certainly is not exactly what you were told you were there to do when they were recruiting, right? Lee, we love you, right? And you've been super great in your last role, and we want you to come and do the same thing here. Maybe, right? But it's as likely that the situation is actually quite different. It's as likely that maybe what you know how to do isn't quite right for the culture of the organization. It's likely that you may not have the mandate to make change that has been represented to you. So keeping asking that question of what am I here to do? I push people super hard on that.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's an exchange of value. And it seems like the most common approach to hiring, we were just thinking about senior leaders, let's hire the best we can find and hope for the best, because there isn't a intentional system in place most of the time to create value. Now, the right people will create that, and it can work when that happens, but often it fails because, again, we're not really clear about the value to be created. So if we're paying X for a position, we're making an investment in this leader coming on board. When you get to, and I love how you describe it, the break even. So talk about what that means.
Sure. So again, it comes straight out of, a metaphor of return on investment and value creation, right? It's, how long, I mean, jokes, right? My joke about this is how long does it take before you haven't done damage to your new organization, right? At what point are you a net value creator for the organization? Because you're not initially, right? You're you're consuming value initially as you get up the learning curve, and there's some confusion that surrounds what you're trying to do, and your teams kind of figure out who you are, and maybe a little off balance. And so the idea is that you want to be getting to that point where you've created as much value as you've consumed, and obviously continue to create value beyond that as you possibly can, right? So one focal point is, how do I get myself to that break-even point as quickly as possible?
Yeah, getting up to speed. And, you talk about the need for, or this sort of feeling, to kind of paraphrasing, to act, to do something to prove yourself going in. And you can actually overdo it and destroy everything, right? Not taking the time to learn the lay of the land, what's working really well, and enhancing and going from there. But do you have any examples of where folks have come in and overreacted with the best of intentions and blew things up?
Absolutely. Right. So there's one leader, I didn't coach this leader, but I studied the situation, and he came out of a large industrial company whose name you would recognize and might have been led by a leader, into a much smaller, more relational kind of startup environment. And was focused on solving the problem and not building the relationships, and came out of a culture where there was real discipline in process, in decision making, maybe a little command and control oriented, into this soup, of something that looked more like a tribe, honestly, than it looked like a company. And he generated the immune system reaction you would expect, right? People did not react well to what he was trying to do, and even though he could have created a lot of value, he came in and started trying to do things, to your point, too much, too soon, pushing too hard, and the system reacts when you do that, and it doesn't react well, right? You've got to co-opt the system in situations like that. It's, I use the analogy of an immune system, right? And when I talk about culture, and, you've got to fool the immune system, right? Because otherwise the immune system is going to attack and destroy you. And that's pretty much what happened with him.
Well, it seems like thinking you know what's best before you get the lay of the land can be a giant trap or minefield for you.
Yeah, it can, but it also can be kind of subtle too, Lee, because it can be, I was hired to do what I'm good at doing, right? And you can believe that's true, and you may even be told that's true, but it's not necessarily the whole story, right? And so the risk of sticking with your comfort zone, sticking with what you know how to do, is an ever-present one, and it can be a subtle one. And it's a very human thing, right, to be taken out of that comfort zone, especially when so much is changing in the context of a new role and you're under stress and pressure. It's fairly natural to retreat to what you feel competent to do, right? And so it's not like it's bad people or kind of, bad decision making. It's just a very natural kind of tendency that you have to watch out for. I'm sure the famous coach, Marshall Goldsmith, and the book he wrote, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, right? Well, I always counsel people, figure out whether what got you here is going to get you there. And if not, what do you got to work on, right? What do you got to give up? Maybe it's things that you love to do and are very good at doing, and what do you need to embrace, which may be things you don't feel so competent to do, right? Or don't so much enjoy doing. So it can be the kind of the coming with the answer in its rawest form, but it can also be just, sticking too much with your comfort zone, right? And then you identify one too, Lee, that I think is a different trap, but sometimes related trap, which I call the action imperative, right? The feeling that you've got to prove that they, whoever they are, made the right choice in putting you in this role, right? And so you can generate a lot of internal pressure to take action before maybe you're really ready to or should be doing, right? And I always advise people to be careful about the balance between doing and being. You want to be, not that you don't want to be doing, but you've got to be thoughtful about that initial phase of learning and connecting and soaking up the organization before you start trying to do too much.
Yeah, yeah, makes a ton of sense. And I believe if we could be a lot clearer about the value that we're trying to create as an organization, holistically for every leader all the way to the front line, and leaders looking for it coming in, they'll do a lot more of what needs to be done to create the value than doing things that they think they should be doing. Like, is this the right move? Is that the right? Almost feels like as I'm listening, that some leaders come in and just, I'm going to check all these boxes because this is what I'm supposed to do, instead of the value to be created. And then this gets to another area, and I've had a number of discussions with Jack Welch about this, and he and I are pretty aligned that 90% of leadership development dollars spent in the United States and probably globally are completely wasted dollars. And what do you say about that, Michael? What's your view?
Oh, so, as someone who teaches a major program at a business school, I have to be somewhat careful in what I'm going to say next. Obviously, I'm kidding, right? Look, I guess I'm a big believer that in that sort of 70-20-10 theory of development that says 70% of we can put about the percentages. It's all very convenient. It works out that way. But the reality is a lot of what develops people is being on the job, doing things, right? And sometimes the most impactful thing you do to develop people is put them in different roles that help them develop different capabilities, right? And that's the 70% of leadership development. The 20% is more coaching and mentoring oriented. And it's a more one-to-one kind of coaching, advising, mentoring, whatever the mix is you want to be, pointing to. And, I think there is value in all three of having good advisors, having good mentors, and having good coaches. And that little triangle, those people play different, but I think quite complementary roles in helping develop you as a leader, right? Now it's why, again, just so I'm not shooting myself too much in the foot here. I think that's why, the programs I teach have a whole lot of group and individual coaching built into them, right? So there's both peer group work where you're working with a group of peers and a coach pretty intensively. And then there's one-to-one coaching, right? And so, and I'd be crucified for saying what I'm about to say, or probably will, right? But the coaching adds, an enormous amount of the value of the program, right? The concepts are helpful, the connections are helpful, but really putting that stuff into action is where you start to have an impact, and really grappling with the big questions that people are facing, right? So that's the 20%. Of the 10% that remains is that formal programmatic stuff, right? Which does add value, but it's of the order, I think, 10% plus minus, right? And what happens is organizations place too much emphasis on that and not enough on are we moving our people through the right roles, giving them the right experiences, exposing them to the right people? Are we setting them up to be advised, coached, mentored in a way that's going to develop those future high potentials? And then, for sure, there's some formal development, although even there, the formal development work that you do, putting a group of people from the same organization, the way we do most of our stuff at IMD, a lot of it's just about creating connection, shared language, shared frameworks that people can then use to work on and ideally change the organization, right? So it's not that we're kind of instilling a single concept into people. It's the social learning that happens, and the connectivity and the creation of the culture and the frameworks, the shared frameworks that people use. That to me is the best of that 10%, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's value in all the pieces that you're talking about, and probably more. It's coming up with the right combination for each leader, given the value they want to create. And what I highly value about your work and Porter and Collins and so many others is that you help us think about thinking, but also you make correlations. You see things that we don't see because I've been on the front lines. I'm on my 7th business. I started from scratch. I love being in the game, but I need to stick my head up and look around, and you help us do that and see things we otherwise wouldn't see. And also, I think where you're going, and it's fully aligned with what my thinking is. If a leader's designed that role that they're in, wherever it is, frontline, middle management, senior leader, to create this value, what do they need next in their development to create even more value, to keep growing that and eventually accelerating it. And it's a constant moving target in there. And I've worked, like Michael, with a lot of large companies. And one of the questions I always ask the HR teams, what are you doing around leadership development? Oh, we have great programs. They're amazing. We send everybody. And well, how do you know they're great? Well, we get great reviews. And I said, well, can you point to any objectively measurable improvement in the leader's results from doing it? And the answer 99% of the time is no. Right.
Yeah.
So
no, it's super interesting, Lee, that you're saying it, right? And it also, you have to go back to, first of all, do you really understand what your leaders need to be able to do to be successful? Right. Not, some, dry competency model, but you have a reasonably good sense of what they really need to do and do well, right? Is it about how they show up? Is it about their strategic thinking ability, right? Is it the leadership of teams? And those are common things that people, point to. And then are you assessing your leaders against those capabilities, right? So you know where they are and who already has some capability and where the gaps are, right? And then you can start to talk about, okay, how are we going to help those people? And then you get into what experiences they need, what coaching and mentoring do they need? Is a developmental program going to be helpful, right? That's kind of the way I think about it, the way I think at IMD, we generally think about it. But you need to start at the very beginning, right? With a clear-eyed view of, okay, at this level, and oh, by the way, given where we're going as an organization, not necessarily where we are, what do we need our leaders to be great at? And then real rigor in how you assess people against that. Not for performance assessment reasons, but for developmental reasons. You've got to be super careful with that. Yeah. And then the point about evaluating programs, I'm smiling a little bit because, I teach this short, it's a 3-day, virtual first 90 days program through IMD. I just was doing one last week. And very proud of the program, I should say, right? Group coaching, individual coaching, concepts for me, fully virtual, blah, 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 right? But like most programs, the evaluation afterwards has been, did you have a good time? Yes, Michael, I had a good time, right? Do you feel like you learned something? Yeah, I feel like I learned something. We're now sort of pushing on from that. We're actually running a pilot of impact assessment with that program that focuses on the learning application and the business ROI. So we're trying to engage the hiring manager. We've got people very early in their transitions, and we're trying to engage them. And 6 months out, we'll do some assessment of, did the people coming through the program actually apply the ideas in ways that were helpful? And do their managers feel like, that created business value for them? So we're trying to go beyond what you're describing, which is kind of this very, it's better than nothing. We want people to have good time in our programs, Lee, and we want them to come away feeling like they learned something useful, right? But unless you can start to get to that deeper application layer and ROI layer, you're kind of making it up really about how much value you're creating.
Yeah, well, we know we're doing leadership development correctly when the results are improving. If they're not improving, we're doing something wrong. Let's go back to the drawing board and do it over again. And I don't find many organizations that have a clear definition of what it means to be a leader in their organization. If you talk to John C. Chambers, he would say the definition of leadership is they get results. I add to it and I say, the definition of leadership for me within an organization is get results and foster an environment where every team member is intrinsically motivated and empowered to get more results over time or create, more value over time.
I agreed 100%. But one would hope managers, achieve results too. I'm kidding, right? But it's, you got to be careful with definitions like that. I also think you have to localize on the level and the organization a bit too, So a number of years ago, I did a study about what happens as you kind of go to enterprise leadership level, on a leadership team, business leadership team for the first time, maybe leading a business. And what's different about leading at that level, then, a step or two down. And I, what came out of the research there are some pretty big shifts in what leaders need to do, right? And it's not that you weren't leading at the director level, you were, right? But what you need to do at, the VP, SVP, EVP level, is just different, right? And, there were 7 shifts I identified, and one of them related to, the book I wrote is Tactician to Strategist, right? You need to, a lot of how you are successful as a leader at up to the level of director is really delivering results, right? Executing well, solving problems well. You get up to a higher level, and it's not so much about problem solving as it is setting the agenda for the organization, right? Designing and transforming the organization, setting the strategy for the organization, managing that complex of internal and external relationships. So, what made you, it's back to what we were talking earlier, what made you successful as a leader at the director level? It may be quite different when you get to a SVP or EVP level. So I think being clear again about what population you're focusing on and what does effective leadership mean at that particular level or for that particular population, you kind of got, I think, to get that granular to really have an impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always thought about it, and I've, again, on my 7th business, I've started from scratch, and the biggest one, we had a little over 500 employees, and we were doing business in 60 countries. It was aerospace related. We were in the aftermarket, so we repaired, overhauled, and reduced aircraft operating costs so they could safely accomplish their missions. And I thought of every team member as leading an influence in some way. It didn't matter whether you had a manager or leader title in there. And my goal was to get everybody to think and act like they were the CEO of their own role and how they created value. And it was incredible. And it's such a complex business. We did 97% of everything in-house. You could give us a data plate off of a helicopter and we could build the entire helicopter. The electroplating, the machining, the grinding, the assembly, everything we did. And I don't think it would have been possible to grow that way without everybody sort of thinking like that. It was like a mini Honeywell we had in this 300,000 square foot of facility. Cool. Yeah.
It also, it gets us into, and I'm just going to turn things around and ask you a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Oh, of course.
How did you instill that sense of purpose in the organization, right? Because to me, what you're pointing to is an organization that must have, at a very deep level, had a sense of the why and the what and the how, was really powerfully aligned about what it was doing. And I guess I'm curious how you, and by the way, it goes directly, I think about, as you, I think, do a lot about leadership in energetic terms. Leadership ultimately is about mobilizing and focusing and sustaining the energy of your organization, right? How do you do that? Yeah. How did you do it? Like, how did you get that sense of energy, alignment, purpose?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces that have to go in. You have to align incentives and all that. Sure, we understand that. Very few do that well, by the way. But I thought about value creation in 3 different buckets. The material value creation is what's left over. I believe every organization at the top in the for-profit world has one number that says above all others are winning or losing the game and drives the majority of the right behavior. So maybe it's EBITDA, cash flow, whatever you want to call that. Everything else is subordinate: culture, leadership, all of it. But I also thought about emotional energy value being created, and that's the X factor for leaders. I think it's the scarcest commodity on the planet. I'd rather live only half as long if I could be on 9 or 10 the entire time, as opposed to twice as long in 1 or 2. The life would be so much more enriching. And when I think about spiritual value creation, in the context of organizations, for me, it's being connected to something bigger. It's the community. It's how we feel about each other, how we care about each other. And the one organization that I'm talking about here, with just over 500 employees, when I sold it in 2016 to Textron, is in the entire time, I think there were probably 64, 65 leaders when I sold it. Never had a leader quit ever. I've had to ask a few to leave, and I think I changed my leadership team out over the 23 years of that journey 5 times completely. That's okay. Those things happen. Most of them found roles where they could continue creating a lot of value for the organization. So I thought about being super intentional in all three of those buckets. And when it came to culture, we had alignment tools, we had a vision, a mission, a quality policy, leadership traits, behaviors. But before we even developed any of them, we came up with a really strong reason for having it. For example, mission statement, we wanted to tell our customers in a compelling way, this is why you should do business with us. And at the same time, tell every employee why they have a job. And it was to safely reduce aircraft operating costs. And then we developed it, and every 6 months, every team member in the organization had to have one example of how they applied it to measurably improve the business. And it was something they owned. It wasn't a suggestion box, something they owned. If they could do it, great. If they couldn't, they'd take it to their team, or they'd, bounce it up levels to get it done if it was valuable enough. And so we made the alignment tools come alive. It was incredible. I remember the first time I met Jack Welch in 2008. On day one, he was facilitating a 2.5-day management course, 100 people in the room, most people managing over $1 billion businesses. I was coming off a $10 million a year. It was quite a bit smaller back then. And we went first, and, as nobody at my table knew their stuff, I said, this is the mission. This is why we developed it. And that's great. What are your values? Well, we threw those out. We went to behaviors for these reasons. Here's what we want to accomplish. And there was a super long, uncomfortable silence. And I thought, gosh, maybe I don't belong here. I should leave. And he goes, that's perfect. I wouldn't change anything. And then at lunch, he came and sat right next to me, blew off his table that everybody drew to sit with him at lunch on day one, and said, I've done this thousands of times. Nobody's ever gotten it right till you. How the hell did you do it? That was the quote. And I'm just doing what makes sense. Apply math, common sense, logic, facts, reason to creating value. And we're all going to go down the same road, past the same wisdom, road signs, et cetera. And then the last piece, Michael, is aligning incentives. I'm a big believer in open book management. Every team member had all the financials they wanted, whatever you want. And if you didn't understand debits and credit, we'd give you a plain English version of the detailed trial balance. But we would share a percentage of all the profit proportionate to everyone's income in the building. So for round numbers sake, if payroll is $1 million and bonus amount of profit was $100,000, everybody got a 10% bonus, 25% each month, 75% held for end-of-year accumulation. We had to sustain performance, or that could go away. And now everybody's like, what's the behavior you're trying to drive? Everybody's incentivized to help everybody else in the organization earn another dollar and build emotional energy value and the spiritual community connectedness value that we had. There's so much here. You and I probably talk about it for a couple of days.
No, this is fabulous, right? I'm loving listening to you say this, right? Because I think, you're exemplifying, what I think is, it's all about that mobilizing and focusing and sustaining the energy of the organization, right? And the various tools that want you to do that. Tools sounds a little instrumental, but that sense of shared purpose, right? We're there to reduce aircraft operating costs, right? That's why we exist, right? That's the sense of purpose that we're driving, right? That sense of connectivity that you're creating, not just through that mission or purpose, but also through the shared, incentive system that aligns everybody's effort against, the performance in the organization, right? So that no one's going to be out there trying to, put their own best interests forward, because they're only hurting themselves if they do that in the end, right? And I suspect we could have a really long conversation about how you do this, and I'm sure you've written a lot about this too, right? The selection of the people that you have in that organization, right? What kind of people do you want, in there that are capable of embracing the ideas and the commitment level you're asking of people, right? I mean, we didn't talk a whole lot about this, but, it goes back to the conversation about onboarding. The best onboarding in the world can't compensate for the sins of recruiting, right? If you're not recruiting somebody, and I gave you that example of someone coming out of GE, great person, bad fit, right? And so, and that, by the way, could also get us into a conversation about when you hire, do you hire for best athlete or do you hire for fit to the team? And what's the right mix of those two? And of course, it depends, right, on the situations.
Yeah.
But thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, for me, the onboarding process, super important to hire for culture and capability. And be super clear. Obviously, the culture piece matters, and doing chemistry checks. I'm a big fan of that. Just come in and meet with the people you'll be working with, no agenda. If one of them has a gut feeling this isn't somebody that's going to be a cultural fit, don't hire them. And that works really well. And then on the capability side, here's the outcomes that we're going to need you to achieve. Do you think you can do it? Yes or no? Absolutely. That's fantastic because the whole team needs you to do this. And if it falls below this level, it won't work. Do you understand that? Oh, yeah, something's wrong with me if it doesn't work. And then when it does fall below the level, 9 out of 10 or more of those conversations are pretty easy to have. It's not personal. Thank you so much for trying. But I think it's, and the onboarding, all that's really important. But what I found to be by far the most important is the environment that we create from which everybody creates value. And it's the rules of engagement. So, I don't think the humans that work for government are different than the humans that work for nonprofits, that work for large public companies and they're all the same, but there's something about those environments that cause different behaviors, right? So we create the environment from which they create value. And that's, the biggest deficit in the world today for me is capable leadership. They're smart, they're capable, they're conscientious, they're moral, they're benevolent. And they're not creating the environment. They're going after the money a lot of times and you could have a company make billions of dollars and everybody goes, oh, that was so amazing. But yet when you step all the way back, and I love your systems thinking approach and how to think about this, the net effect was significantly negative in how much value they took out of the world based on their actions to make a few $1 billion. So that was a ton that I said there, but how do you think about capable leadership?
No. So this is so critical, right? And I think our views about what great leadership looks like are virtually perfectly aligned. And I guess also just, I think, if there's been a time in the history of our species when we more needed leadership, I'm not sure when it was, maybe the Second World War, maybe we can come up with good examples of when, the situation called leaders, right? And I think situations do call leaders, right? Leaders tend to emerge sometimes in periods of great difficulty. And I guess I'm really hoping that's what's going to happen, right? That as we continue down the road of the many challenges we're going to face, that kind of leadership is enough there and emergent in a way that's going to make a difference. Because, it's a challenging situation. I mean, part of the reason I wrote the book on strategic thinking is because the world is just so complicated and so uncertain and so turbulent. And, not that strategic thinking was unimportant, right? But when things were more stable, you could do strategic planning over long horizons, right? Back in the heydays of the 50s, 60s, 70s, you could do this long-term planning. Today, you've got to be shifting and adapting, almost in real time, right? And that capacity to be able to recognize, prioritize, mobilize to deal with emerging challenges and opportunities, which I see as kind of the core of strategic thinking. It's hugely important right now, right? And I think lots of organizations that don't have leadership that can do that are not going to survive the challenges of AI, the challenges of, other technology advance. It's just so big what's happening right now. But what do you think? I mean, maybe I'm overly pessimistic about the state of the world. And actually, I shouldn't say I'm pessimistic. I just see it as profoundly challenging times for leaders, and calling up therefore some unique and different capabilities to lead us through all that.
Yeah. When you go back, I'm not a giant history buff, but when you go back thousands of years, we've been at these critical points quite a number of times. And it feels like, we're too comfortable for too long. And then certain non-value creators, they rig the game and they create a terrible culture and environment. And then everybody wakes up, makes a change. and it gets better, and then we get comfortable again. And so we go through these cycles. So I think this is kind of necessary that we go through it. And I'm seeing a lot of thought leaders wake up that are true value creators, not gang riggers. And I just want to be a happy warrior on the battlefield here, pushing value creation in the world and proportionally, pushing back on things that take value out of the world at scale. And Michael, that's my definition of practicing virtue. It's that you're creating real, measurable, objectively measurable value, and you're pushing back on things that are taking value out of the world. And most people today, they're more virtue signalers than they are practicing actual virtue. Like, let's talk about how good I am. In fact, I believe the most powerful weapon in recorded history is weaponizing false morality. And you've got all these, large corporations, and not all, but a lot of them, and small and mid-sized companies too, that talk about how great they are, so you'll do business with them. So in a way, that's mildly to moderately to severely weaponizing false morality, in my view. And if we could think differently about that, that's why I wrote a book last year with a friend of mine called The Value Creation Kid: The Healthy Struggles Your Children Need to Succeed, about working backwards from what's this ideal high school senior launched into adulthood look like? What do you want? They can think critically. They're self-reliant. They're financially competent, maybe financially independent like I was. They value creating value, community, family, all of it. So what are the healthy struggles we're putting them through to actually get there? And I think that's where we can solve the problem. This is never going away, always going to be here. So I can have personally, talking about me, I can have a bad attitude about it, like most people in this country that like to talk about what's wrong with everything. Or I can have a good attitude. This is kind of normal, and what can I do to influence it? And so I'm always going to be positive no matter what's going on about what's possible.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear that. And I think I'm going to check out that book, right? Because I wouldn't say I struggle with what to tell my kids, but I know that the formulas of the past are not going to necessarily serve them well, right? And I think that some of those things you identified, that adaptability, that capacity to learn, that, that ability to connect with people authentically, to focus on value creation, those are certainly some of the, if not exactly the way you communicated it, the kinds of things I talk to my children about, right? Because, the world we're living in is just so very different, right? And the notion that you're going to have a job for life, like my dad did, right? Never going to happen in a million years. You're going to go through many, many iterations. And what's going to take you through is that, what you talked about, that resilience, that adaptability, that capacity to learn, the ability to see things at the junctions between bodies of knowledge, right? Where true creativity happens. Yeah. So now you're preaching quite literally to the converted when you're talking about this, right? Yeah, and it helps to think that that's possible, right? It's funny what you were saying earlier about kind of bad times producing, being necessary. There is in fact a whole theory of history that is exactly what you just described. That basically says, good times inevitably generate a form of corruption that then creates a crisis that then requires, leadership. And we kind of go through these cycles, right? And it's kind of a shame that we have to do that. But it's also a source of optimism. And I think that's probably where you were going with this, Lee, which is we'll get through this, right? And in part, what'll get us through it is great leadership.
And I think this can't not happen. It's human nature. It's a reason it's happening. And one thing I'd love to get your take on this, like the first discipline in the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking, pattern recognition, connecting the dots to create value is how I think about that. Well, the biggest challenge I find with all of education, K-12 all the way through higher education, is that the whole purpose of an education is missed. And so I do a lot of work in K-12 education, fix the kids, fix the world, so we have an amazing future, right? Because they're going to be running it. And the purpose of an education to me is to create value, and it's holistic value. It's the material, emotional, spiritual. And we're not saying that in the current system, get a good grade, get a diploma, get a degree, get a job. And in that system, kids are doing what they think they're supposed to do instead of discovering what they should be doing and finding their value creation superpower. So I wish we could just foundationally start out with, and that's a big push for the book, Value Creation Kid, get to them before they get to kindergarten. Purpose is to create value in the world. How can we do that? That's what it is. It's not this machine to get people ready to work at a big company that they can discard. And it's not about that. It's about creating value. And there's so many options and ways to do that today. And I think it's going to become, there's going to be more jobs available, more options. AI isn't going to destroy it. It's going to enhance in a lot of ways. This is how I'm looking at the future. It's like abundance of all of that stuff. But how could we do that? How can we get that message through?
Yeah. Well, it's a super observation, right? And I think, part of the reason why I wrote the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking was for it to be about the thinking, and I think that, it's a dimension of what you're talking about. But what a good education should do is teach people how to think and how to learn and how to grow, right? We don't need people's heads stuffed with facts. Not that facts are irrelevant and not that history is irrelevant, because obviously part of learning to think well is understanding, history. But, just as I feel like, one of the big reasons I wrote the book is because, the world has lots of good strategy, right? There's tons that's been written about strategy, and good stuff, right? Don't get me wrong. It's really good value adding stuff, right? Very little about the thinking part, right? What are the disciplines of mind that you need to navigate through the complexities and uncertainties of the world we're in, right? And I think I would connect that to what you're saying, Lee, about education, right? Which is, one would hope that education would teach people how to think, how to reason, how to value, how to discern, and I kind of agree with you. That's not what most education's about.
Well, I think if we can always go back to the touchstone, we're learning how to think about thinking, do strategic planning, any path that somebody takes, technical leadership, doesn't matter. This touchstone of, in order to create more value in the world, how are you applying this? One of the questions I love to ask every time I meet with leaders is, what did you get out of today's session, this discussion, whatever it is that you can use to create more value in your organization or your life? And then I know right away whether they got anything out of it or not. I know how they think about thinking. Are they just super reactionary? Can they go deep? I'm sure you can relate to all of that, but that touchstone, we make the assumption that, of course, everybody knows it's to create value. No, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing that.
Not necessarily. Well, and I'm smiling too, because of the courage required on the part of a speaker after giving or an educator after, like, did that actually create value for you? That, it takes both, courage and confidence to be even to ask that question of an audience, right? And I see people that, they just come and they trot out whatever they trot out. On with the show. Yeah. So.
Well, I have to. I'm not going to, if I'm not conveying value or creating value, I don't want to be part of it. And if they all
it's very central to your ethos, right? I mean, it's really core for you. I can see it. And that's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. So this concept of, seeing the bigger playing field, connecting the dots, as systems thinking as really for anybody. You can be a leader, a manager, non-supervisory team member, somebody that's running the family, looking at the whole playing field and making better decisions to create more value for your community, family, company, organization, whatever it is. I love how you've helped me think even more deeply about thinking and going through your book. Thank you for that. And
absolutely,
the pattern recognition. I'm not sure a lot of folks they're very reactionary. They won't step back and look at the board. And I've got lots of examples where I've learned to cultivate my ability to do that over the years. But talk about that a little bit for our listeners.
Sure. So writing a book on strategic thinking would be, writing a book on strategic thinking, would be interesting, but wouldn't necessarily create a lot of value if the conclusion was you have it and you don't, right? least a strategic thinker or at least not a strategic thinker, because what that leads you down the road of is let's figure out, whether he is or isn't. He is. We're going to, do it. Right. And so, for me, a lot of what's interesting about this was I didn't feel like there was a very precise definition of what strategic thinking is. And without a precise definition, we can't measure it. Right. And if we can't measure it and we don't know what it is, what hope do we have of developing it? Yeah. And so that was kind of part of the journey I was on. And I do believe you can develop strategic thinking capability. However, I think it's also like many other human capabilities, a certain amount of endowment, matters, right? The metaphor I use is, becoming a marathon runner, right? I can train for the rest of my life and I will never be an elite, marathon runner. I may be a better runner than I am currently. But unless you're born with a certain, body weight to strength ratio, a certain kind of muscle fibers, lungs that do certain things, you're never going to be, an elite runner, right? And I used to, I think I mentioned this earlier, I used to teach negotiation for many years, and it was a very similar thing. You saw people who were just naturally really very good at it, right? Not always necessarily moral in how they did it, but they, at a surface level would achieve, in quotes, good results, right? But it was also clear that you could help people get better, right? I mean, I taught negotiation for more than a decade, and, by the end of the programs we did, people were demonstrably better negotiators than when they started. Now we can debate the percentages, right, of how much better you are. I think the same is true with strategic thinking. And so for me, the payoff here is, what can I do to make myself a better strategic thinker? What can I do to communicate that I am a strategic thinker? What can I do to build strategic thinking capability in my team and my organization, right? That's where the payoff of the work comes, and where the being precise about what it is, but also how do you develop it? That's where it adds value in the end, as opposed to being, that's interesting. There's 6 disciplines of strategic thinking. Fascinating, but you know what I mean? So.
Well, I think it's wildly valuable. The part that a lot of people miss. So I agree with you. I think we can all cultivate to get better in these areas. We can. Some people have natural abilities for sure, but we can all cultivate to get better, especially when it comes to the mind. Managing expectations through that journey is like anything that I'm trying to do as a leader and get better and all that. I have to intentionally do it and just, really dig in. And I've learned to actually trust the struggle in a big way. The harder it is, I get a weird, warm feeling inside, like, oh my gosh, this is going to be so great when I come out the other side. And if you're cultivating strategic thinking, it could be exhausting mentally the first year or two where you're really doing it. Then all of a sudden it starts to give you energy. Dots connect faster. You wake up and you see patterns that you didn't see the day before, but you have to go through that process. So talk about the journey and what people can expect going through, because it seems like adults, like kids, don't want to struggle anymore for anything. If it's hard at all, they just stop. Oh, I don't have the ability. No, you could.
Yeah. So, the way I sort of described strategic thinking capability is your endowment plus your experience plus exercise, right? Endowment, that's the machinery you're born with. Experience is what you've done in your life up to that point in time. But the exercise is key, right? And it's like any skill you want to develop, you need to kind of have a workout to do it, right? And I think that, so what I did, and I'll send you the link to it, I developed this little sort of 30 to 40 minute daily strategic thinking workout, right? Here's a list of things you can do. You don't need to do them all in the same half hour. You can spread them out over the day, read the morning news critically and see what kind of trends you see or interesting patterns are emerging from that, right? Journal on an idea you have a conversation with somebody about a strategic issue you're facing. Do a few puzzle games, right? I mean, I personally, with my kids, every day we've got a little, text messenger group, right? And we do Wordle on the New York Times. We do Connections on the New York Times. We do one or two others. We're kind of, somewhat competitive about it, right? But, those different exercises actually help build the muscle, right? word recognition, but making nonlinear connections between words. I don't know. There's a great game in the New York Times site that's free called Connections, right? And it gives you 16 words and you've got to identify 4 groups of 4. And the connections are often very subtle and nonlinear, right? So you can, I'm not a great chess player, but I do the daily chess puzzle on chess.com every day, right? Just because it helps me think about that part of what's the pattern, what's the move, what's the counter move. If I do this and they do that, then, it comes down to just doing basic stuff to kind of build the muscles in your brain. A bit of reflection at the end of the day, right? But to your point, you've got to be willing to do the work, right? Or as with anything, you're not going to get fitter, you're not going to get thinner, you're not going to build your strategic thinking kit. And then I think there's a whole piece of this that's quite interesting. That's about, if you're leading a team, how do you begin to build strategic thinking capability in that team, right? And the answer is not, similar to the conversation we had earlier, run a strategic thinking workshop. That may be helpful, may be a part of what you do, right? But you've got to create a culture within which strategic thinking is valued. You've got to embed strategic thinking in your operating rhythms in some way. And then, by the way, absolutely do some maybe more focused and skill-based. So that's kind of where I am and going with this, Lee, if that makes sense.
I love it. I love that you're doing the work. And I'm a huge fan of building capabilities while creating value in the organization, because now we're connecting it to something meaningful. And it's pretty easy to see whether we're doing it right, yes or no going through. So this has been a fascinating discussion. We got into barely 2 of the 6 disciplines. I could talk to you for a long time about this. Thank you for making the time today to have this discussion. I hope we can have more.
I would love to do it. I really enjoyed it. And thank you.
All right, Michael, thank you. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast, where we explore the art of value creation. If you got some value from today's episode, please like and leave a review of the episode. And until next time, please show your value to the world.